Hey, welcome back. This is History with Hilbert, and today I'm going to be doing a book review. Now, the book I'll be reviewing is called Millennium, and it's by Tom Holland. And what it's about, well, the clue's in the title. It's called Millennium, and it is indeed about the first millennium AD, so it focuses on the year 1000 after the death of Christ. Now, I finished this book a few days ago. I read it in about a month and a half. I bought it while I was in York, where I actually went to see the author, who is Tom Holland, to see him speak about his newest book, which is about King Athelstan, who was an Anglo-Saxon king who basically united England into one nation as we know it today. And he's a very, very good speaker, and this comes across in his book as well, because he uses this very carefully chosen vocabulary to really paint a picture with words of the image that he is trying to show in his writing. And because of this, I have really enjoyed reading Millennium over this past month and a half. I've liked the idea of sitting down and reading this book, and I think you guys might enjoy this too. So I'm hoping that perhaps if this is what you are interested in, if this sounds like the kind of content that you would like me to make videos about, that you would also find this book interesting and might like to buy or borrow it from the library or whatever, so that you can read it as well. And as I said, I'll go into some of what this book was actually about, so that you can see if this is really what you're after or maybe not. So he covers the following areas in quite a lot of detail. So you've got, for instance, the Frankish rise to power, and obviously Charlemagne is the big name when you think of the Franks. But not only Charlemagne, also the origins of how the Franks, who were just a small tribe, eventually becomes this great European-wide empire under, I believe it's Clovis the First in his whole story, with his sons with Lothar, and then with Pepin and Charlemagne, Charles Martel. And that's really interesting to see how Francia rises to power. But then also, if you're looking at the Frankish rise to power, you have to look at the disintegration of Francia under the sons of, I believe Charlemagne had one son, and then he had three sons, and then the Frankish tradition was to split things equally into the amount of sons you had. So if you had three sons, then your empire would be split into three pieces. And if one of them was called Nuestria, and then you had the central one, which just fell apart, and then you had the other one. And that's basically where we get France and Germany from today, but that's a whole other story, a whole other video. But that's really interesting. So then with the Franks, after that, we look at the Saxons. And the Saxons, about their rise from being these pagans who fight against Charlemagne and the Franks, to going right to the top and becoming Holy Roman Emperors, and the eventual founders of the Habsburg dynasty, which is really awesome to look at as well, because I shamefully didn't know about this kind of thing in much detail, but now I can honestly say that I really do know a lot more thanks to reading this book. And with this Holy Roman Empire, obviously, you learn about some of the emperors. So you learn about Henry the First, Second, Third, and Fourth, about Conrad the First and Second, and Otto the First, Second, and Third, who were all Holy Roman Emperors. And I found Otto the First was a really cool guy. Like, I really enjoyed reading about him. So I think I might make a few videos. And as well, there were some other characters that came up, like Fulk Nera, who was the, I think the Duke of Anjou. He sounds like a really cool character. I think Tom Holland really describes him well. He sounds like the kind of guy that you would want to go on an adventure with, sort of the kind of badass of the Middle Ages, the Fulk Nera. So I'll probably be making a video about him as well. And in other chapters, it goes on to give descriptions of the Norsemen, so not only in Scandinavia, but also abroad. So, for example, in Normandy, and how this transition from pagan Scandinavians went to these Normans, who, I still need to make a video about, and I will, but how they transitioned from these Scandinavian pirates to these sort of semi-Frankish warrior kings of Europe. And as well, obviously, the Vikings and their raids and attacks and eventual conquests of and in Britain, and then inevitably also the Anglo-Saxons. And it does a good job of both intertwining the story of the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, as they inevitably are, but also at looking into the Anglo-Saxons on their own. So you don't just have the Anglo-Saxons being, bedraggled and butchered by the Vikings. They are given their own limelight, which I think is essential to every culture that you study. And then also it goes right to the other corners of Europe. So it goes, for example, Al-Andalus, which was the Muslim kingdom, or caliphate rather, in Spain at this time. And then it also goes into a little bit at the start of the Reconquista, which was when the Spanish Christians retook their land from the Muslim invaders. And as well as this, it doesn't just look at, shifting empires and these different groups and kings and conquest. It also looks at the social side of things. It looks a lot at the religious side, obviously, because it's the Dark Ages. And as I said before, one of the main themes of this book is this theme of an impending apocalypse, the end of the world, because people thought that 1,000 years after Christ's death, which was the Millennium, 1000 AD, 1000 Anno Domini, the year after Christ's death, that Christ would be resurrected, but then Antichrist would come, and there would be this great battle across the earth, and the gates of hell would open, and these two strangers called Gog and Magog from the dark and misty corners of the world, they would come across, and then all these portents of flaming crosses in the sky, and Jesus weeping blood, all these terrible, horrifying things to these peasants. They thought the end of the world was coming. And it's really interesting to see how this not only changed, the susceptible peasants, who you can imagine would be completely and utterly in awe of these things, but also of the people right at the top of the social scale. So you've got things like the emperors, and how their rules and how their reigns rather are changed because of this thought that the end of the world is coming, and will I be ready, and will my kingdom be ready for the end of the world when we will be judged by God? And it's really interesting, and this is one of the themes that continues throughout, as is the theme of what is the role of the papacy, and what is the relationship between the papacy, so the Pope, and between the emperors. Because I'm going on to another theme here. One of the other themes is who's going to replace the Romans, and this is something that happened in Europe quite a lot, because obviously the Roman Empire, once it fell, it was, it was seen as the end of the world. The Romans were the big civilizers, and they were the ones who spread Christianity. They were the big upholders of the faith of Christendom. They were the strong bulwark against the end times. And when Rome fell, well, it was like Jerusalem falling. It was seen as the end of the world, possibly even the end of Christendom. So in the Dark Ages, especially before the Millennium, we see all these people trying to become the Romans. So you have the Franks. Charlemagne, he becomes the next Holy Roman Emperor, and he conquers lots of Europe, and he copies the Romans in many ways. You've got Charlemagne, then you've got the Holy Roman Emperors, so you've got things like Otto I, he is crowned Caesar, and then you have this relationship between these various people who are crowned Caesar, even though they're not Romans, they're Franks or Saxons or Germans or Bavarians or whatever. You have this relationship between them and with the papacy, and who is in charge of who, and it's very interesting to see how this changes. Now, at the start, we see that the Saxons and Charlemagne, they are very much the guys who have the hand on the steering wheel in this situation. I think it's Otto the Second or Otto the Third, I think, is the one who deposed 3 popes in 1 week. Quite the badass as well, which I should definitely make a video about. But then his son Henry IV is quite worse at dealing with the popes, and he actually, Pope Gregory, turns the tables on him and makes the papacy the all-powerful force. And this is obviously very important for later medieval times, when one man in Rome could topple empires literally just by excommunicating a king. And it's really interesting to see how this starts and how this develops as time goes on. And then finally, you've also got things like the Byzantines, because they, remember, were the remnants of the Roman Empire, and how the challenges for the Byzantines start to build up, and how their relationship with the West changes. First they still had a tangible grip on the West in Italy and the south of Italy, and then the rise of Islam and how they had to fight against the Muslims, both the Saracens and then the Turks, and the Muslims on Sicily. So it's very interesting to see how all these different cultures come together. And one thing that Tom Holland does really well is, obviously, you've got all these different individual threads. So you've got this thread about the Franks, and you've got this thread about the Saxons, then you've got this Norseman thread in Normandy, and then the Normans, and you've got the Saxons and the Pope and the Muslims. But he's very clever in that he weaves all these stories, all these threads, and then suddenly in a chapter they all come together. So you have someone from one chapter, so for example you have Falknera, and then in a different chapter he is telling about the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and then suddenly Falknera's there. So you see how these things are connected. And that's a really cool story, actually, about Fulknera at the Holy Sepulchre, which I will have to tell another time because this video is getting too long. But it really, Millennium is full of lots of interesting little tidbits of brilliant information that are really, really fun, really good to know, good to read. So I would really highly recommend you read this. And I will stop talking because I have been going on for quite a while, and I am well aware that you have lives to get back to. But if you can get your hands on Millennium, I strongly, strongly suggest that you do, because I have really enjoyed reading this book, and I think you all will too. And I will definitely be making videos from the information that I have learnt from reading this. So we can all thank Tom Holland and his excellent wordsmanship with Millennium for that. Alright everyone, thank you very much for watching if you're still with us at this point. I hope you've enjoyed my little review of Millennium by Tom Holland, and as I said, I would recommend you read it if you can. I'm going to leave you with a little reading from the book that I particularly enjoyed so that you can get a flavour of what it's like to read Millennium and the style that Tom Holland uses. Loathing of the Normans did the rest. As the grey outline of Mount Gargano began to loom on the eastern horizon, and a rendezvous with his new Byzantine allies drew ever nearer, Leo could feel well content. Even when the enemy, frantically mustering their scattered forces and riding hell for leather northwards, unexpectedly interposed themselves between the papal forces and those of Constantinople, he was not unduly alarmed. The Normans, despite their success in keeping their opponents apart, were exhausted, hungry, and comprehensively outnumbered. Against all the teeming hordes kicking up dust behind the Pope, they could hardly set 3,000. Unsurprisingly, they sought a truce. Equally unsurprisingly, the Pope refused to grant one. Having laboured so hard to get the Normans where he wanted them, he was now resolved to crush them once and for all. Except that the Normans did not wait to be crushed. Instead, without warning, and even as their ambassadors were keeping Leo distracted still with negotiations, their horsemen threw themselves upon the papal ranks with all the ferocity of starving wolves assailing a flock of sheep. The Italians turned tail and fled. Only the Swabians, hulking, long-haired giants armed with massive two-handed swords, stood firm amid the rout. Not until the end of the day were they finally overwhelmed. Preeminent among the captains who finally succeeded in trampling them down, slicing off their heads from their shoulders and splitting open their guts, was Robert Guiscard.